Hey guys! Tonight, we step into the skin of someone whose name was never written, whose face was never painted, and whose life was never really lived, not fully. We're going to talk about the kind of person history doesn't bother to remember, the medieval assassin. Not the kind with epic theme music and billowing cloaks, but the kind who smelled like mildew, lied for a living, and knew exactly how long a man takes to die when stabbed in the stomach. This isn't fantasy. This is rot, blood, silence, and survival. If you enjoy this kind of shadowy storytelling, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more beautifully bleak history, and share it with someone who thinks being a rogue in an RPG qualifies as career planning. Also, let me know in the comments what time it is where you are, and if you'd last 5 minutes in the Middle Ages. Spoiler, you wouldn't. Now, dim the lights. Let the room hum a little, and let's slip into the story, quietly. You never know who's listening. It didn't start with blood. It started with silence. A kind that settles in the bones before language, before law, before anyone even knows you're there. You don't become an assassin. You're sculpted by neglect, hammered by poverty, carved by the kind of childhood that teaches you not to cry, because crying attracts hands and sometimes fists. In a forgotten village too small to bother naming, someone was born without witnesses. No midwife, no prayers, just a woman squatting in dirt and a scream swallowed by the wind. That scream would be the loudest sound that person ever made. Everything after that would be quiet. Very, very quiet. His cradle was a sack of grain that no longer had grain. His name was borrowed from a dead cousin no one liked. His childhood was filled with things that didn't happen. No birthdays, no books, no warmth. Just chores, hunger, and the growing talent of not being seen when someone was angry. And in those early years, he learned the first rule of survival. If they can't see you, they can't hurt you. That rule stuck. It became gospel. He wasn't strong. He wasn't clever. But he had a gift. He knew how to vanish in plain sight. Not with magic. With despair. While other boys dreamed of glory and girls and goats, he dreamed of silence. Rooms so still he could hear the dust settle. Paths so empty even the birds held their breath. By 10, he'd already been blamed for 3 thefts he didn't commit, and ignored for 2 he did. By 12, he was stealing bread with a face so blank that shopkeepers apologized for not seeing him sooner. By 14, he was gone. No goodbyes. No plans. Just gone. Cities are cruel, but predictable. They chew up boys like him and spit them into brothels, kitchens, or graves. But somehow, he slipped through. Not because he was smart. Because he was forgettable. A boy-shaped blur in a world too busy to notice the parts that didn't shine. He slept in alleys, learned to count coins by weight and smell, and watched men kill each other over shoes that didn't even match. He learned to walk like he belonged, to look like he'd always been there, to talk just enough, to smile just a little, to disappear just before the questions started. And then one night, in a tavern that smelled like wet wood and regret, a man placed a hand on his shoulder. It wasn't a friendly hand. It was the kind of hand that came with names, and promises, and an unspoken understanding that the first favor was free, but nothing ever was. He didn't ask what the job was. He didn't need to. The coin was heavy. The man was impatient. And the boy was hungry. Not for food, for a way out, That night, he didn't kill anyone, but he followed someone who would. And when the blade slipped, and the blood whispered, and the body crumpled like old parchment, he felt nothing. Not guilt, not fear, just interest. Like watching a magician reveal a trick you already knew the answer to. That was the first lesson. It doesn't take a monster to kill a man. Just a reason, or the absence of one. He didn't sleep that night. Not because of nightmares. Because for the first time, he understood something most people never dared admit. He didn't want a future. He wanted control. And control, in this world, didn't come with titles or prayers. It came with a knife, and the knowledge of where to put it. That was the beginning, not of a career, but of an undoing. They say your first kill changes you. That's a lie told by people who've never had to do it twice. The truth is, the first kill is easy. You're numb. You're focused. You're hungry. Your hands are shaking, but your mind is clean, because it hasn't learned yet how to tremble. He didn't plan it. He didn't rehearse. There was no dramatic stalk through the shadows, no whispered final words. There was just a man, a shadow, a flash, and then stillness. No scream, just the sound of a wet cloth dropped on stone. The blood surprised him. Not its color, that was just rust in moonlight, but the warmth. It clung to his fingers like a question he didn't want to answer. It was oddly intimate, like touching the inside of a secret. The man had a ring. He took it, not for the value, it wasn't worth much, but for the weight. He needed something to remind him it happened, because by morning, the memory would already be fading like smoke. That's how it starts. You think the first one will haunt you, but it doesn't. Not if you're good at this. Not if you're built for this. It drifts. Softly. Like ash. Sleep refused him. Not because of nightmares, but because something in his veins kept humming, like static before a storm. It wasn't pride. It wasn't triumph. It was the terrifying clarity of someone who's finally seen their reflection and didn't flinch. The world looked different the next day. Slower. Like everything had been dulled except him. He walked past the same people, the same doors, the same dogs pissing on the same barrels. But none of them saw him, because they never did. And now, he could kill one of them and still vanish between heartbeats. And that knowledge, that tasted better than food. The man who gave him the job didn't say, "Well done." Just slid another coin across the table, this one heavier. This time with a name attached. A name that came with risk. That was the second lesson. One kill leads to two. Because people talk. And whispers breed offers. And offers breed blood. And blood, once spilled, becomes currency. He didn't think about the man's family, or what he did for a living, or if he deserved it. He'd already decided. Deserve didn't exist. It was a word invented by men in robes to explain why they weren't on the floor bleeding. The second kill came easier, cleaner, quicker. The third? He didn't even remember the man's name. Just the route in, the sound of the lock, the texture of the man's breath stopping. There was no guilt, only logistics. Entry, strike, exit, payment, vanish. He learned to clean a blade with water and vinegar, to wrap it in oiled cloth, to walk like a servant, sleep like a rat, and lie like a priest. People started referring to him without using words. A nod, a glance, a silence that said, "I know someone." That's when it gets dangerous. Because reputations echo, and echoes bring eyes. The city was a furnace of secrets. Everyone owed someone. Everyone feared someone. And someone, always, wanted someone dead. He became a rumor. A shadow that walked with a limp that changed legs. A whisper that smelled of iron and candle wax. A man who could be anyone, or no one. And through it all, he remained hungry. Not for food, not for coin, but for control. Control was the drug. The dagger was delivery. Because deep down, he knew something most people couldn't bear to admit. Killing isn't hard. Not being seen while doing it. That's the real art. And in that art, he was a prodigy. Before the blade ever left its sheath, there was routine. Not dramatic, not glorious. Only the same quiet rituals repeated until muscle and mind stopped arguing. He woke long before the market stalls groaned open. Before the baker lit his oven or the priests rolled their scrolls. There was no alarm. Only the instinct of a man who knew that danger didn't knock. It seeped. His morning was mechanical. Not peaceful, efficient. A cracked basin. Cold water. One cloth. No soap. Clean enough to pass. Dirty enough to be invisible. He inspected his boots. Not for fashion, for silence. No creaks, no stones wedged in the sole. No scent of new leather that could betray a step. The dagger was examined like a surgeon checking a heartbeat. No rust, no reflection. A blade that didn't gleam, because light was the enemy. Breakfast was never a meal. Half a heel of bread. A sip of water that smelled faintly of iron. Enough to keep him steady. Not enough to dull his edge. He practiced his walk. Each street had its own tempo. Too fast and you looked guilty. Too slow and you looked lost. He walked like someone with a purpose too boring to question. Every town had its signals. Dogs barking in sequence. Laundry lines moved from left to right. A vendor who didn't show up 2 days in a row. He noticed everything and remembered nothing. No one knew his name. Sometimes, neither did he. He changed it with the wind, with the job, with the tone of the bartender's voice when asking too many questions. He avoided pleasure like a torch in a dark room. Every indulgence was a spotlight, and he only existed in shadows. The places he slept had no windows, but corners. Corners don't lie. They don't let you be surrounded. He kept no keepsakes, no lucky charms, no sentimental junk. The past was a luxury. His only god was distance. And at night, before every job, he said nothing. No prayer, no promise, just a moment of stillness. Not to honor the kill, but to remind himself that vanishing wasn't an act. It was a condition, a full-time state of decay. You'd think the real monsters carried knives. They didn't. They carried rings, and titles, and the kind of perfume that tried too hard to smell like innocence. They met him in places where no dust settled. Rooms with too many cushions and too little honesty. Places that reeked of candle wax, ambition, and quiet betrayal. They never used the word murder. That was for the gutter. They preferred euphemisms wrapped in lace, eliminate, correct, simplify the situation. Sometimes they'd smile. Sometimes they'd cry. Once, one of them toasted to necessary endings. He said nothing. Let them decorate the contract however they liked. By the time the blade did its work, all poetry bled the same. The nobles weren't brave. They were bored. Too many threats, too many rivals, too many awkward dinners where someone looked at their wife for too long. Most of the time, they didn't even name the target directly. Just a first name, a location, a sigh too long to be casual. He learned to read between coughs, pauses, and the way fingers curled around goblets. They offered coin, of course. Sometimes jewels. One once offered him a vineyard. He declined. Vines need sunlight. What struck him most wasn't their cruelty, it was their detachment. They ordered death like someone ordering wine they'd pretend to enjoy. And when it was over, no thanks, no gratitude, silence, or worse, a new job wrapped in the phrase, "Since you handled the last matter so efficiently." The more noble the client, the more layers of denial. He was a tool, useful, replaceable, like a candle, lit, used, and forgotten the moment it burned too low. But tools remember hands. And one day, the wrong noble would smile a little too wide. And the assassin would decide that the job didn't end where they thought it did. He'd seen it once, not love, but the aftertaste. A man begging on his knees, blood between his teeth, whispering a name over and over. Not his own, not the name of a god. The name of someone who'd make the pain mean something. That was his first lesson in attachment. It doesn't prevent the blade. It just makes it shake before it lands. He never planned to fall. How could he? You can't fall when you spend your whole life pressed against walls and ceilings, trying to disappear into the frame. But it happens. Not like lightning, more like a draft, slow, subtle, creeping under your defenses before you notice the chill. She worked at an apothecary, not beautiful, not dull, just still, like someone who didn't need to be anywhere else. Her silence didn't press, it welcomed. And he, for once, didn't want to leave. He bought things he didn't need. Lavender, resin, soap he'd never use. Asked questions he already knew the answers to, just to hear her voice explain them softer. Names would have broken it. The silence was safer than anything they might have confessed. They didn't kiss. They didn't touch. But the glances were steady, like the world might hold its breath if they blinked at the same time. For a man who vanished professionally, it was terrifying to be seen. One evening, she handed him a packet of crushed herbs. Nothing unusual, but tucked inside was a note. 4 words. No greeting. No farewell. You don't frighten me. He didn't sleep that night. Not out of guilt. Not excitement. But, wait. He wasn't used to being carried in someone else's thoughts. He should have run. He knew that. Anyone who knew something about him was one misstep from knowing everything. And people who knew everything ended up whispering in cellars. Or bleeding in them. But he stayed. For weeks, he walked slower past the shop. Started wearing less shadow, more neutral. He let her look at him, let her catalogue the details. The scar under the chin. The left eye that never quite met the right one. The twitch in the hand when startled. She never asked. She just let him be. And that was worse than love. It was trust. He started imagining things. A life where names were real. Where coin was earned by carrying, not cutting. Where someone might wait for him without fear, without questions, without candles left burning just in case he didn't return. And then the job came. Of course it did. The target? A merchant. A spice dealer. Someone who'd been growing too bold with foreign deals. The address? 2 doors down from the apothecary, which meant she'd see, or hear, or worse, recognize the silence afterward. He hesitated. For the first time since his first blade, he truly hesitated. That was the 5th lesson. Love doesn't make you human. It makes you vulnerable. And in this line of work, vulnerability is terminal. So he vanished again. Left the coin. Burned the boots. Buried the note. Didn't say goodbye. Just became a rumor in another city. Another inn, another face. But some nights, in rooms too dark and too quiet, he swore he could smell crushed lavender. And he hated that it made him pause. The job was simple. In theory, a nobleman with too many enemies and not enough humility. No guards. No dogs. No magic rings or escape tunnels. Just a throat, a bed, and a very generous client who said the words make it look accidental. Accidents were easy. Falls, fires, poison in the wine. But the client wanted silence. No flames. No drama. Just sleep. Interrupted. He planned it like a craftsman. Studied the doors, the patterns, the lanterns that flickered differently on windy nights. He knew the rhythm of the guards, knew the creak of every step, knew how long the nobleman took to snore after his 3rd cup of honeyed milk. He entered like smoke, bare feet, steady breath, blade tucked in cloth. And there he was, the target, sleeping, face turned slightly toward the window. Mouth open. No dreams. Just the heavy breathing of someone with too many secrets and not enough fear. He reached for the blade. One motion. One cut. But then, a sound. Not loud. Not alarming. Just a sigh. The kind a child makes when turning in bed. And for the briefest second, he saw not a target, but a man. Soft, mortal, so deeply asleep he looked almost innocent. His grip faltered, and that half-second of humanity, it cost him everything. Because the nobleman woke. Not fully, just enough. A flutter of eyelids. A question forming in the dark. He didn't scream. Didn't rise. Just whispered, "Who sent you?" The assassin said nothing, but he hesitated again. It wasn't pity. It wasn't fear. It was the sharp, suffocating knowledge that he could walk away. He didn't. He did the job. Quick, precise, but not clean. Because hesitation stains. The escape wasn't perfect. One servant saw the shadow. One door creaked louder than usual. One footprint landed half in ash, half on polished tile. He made it out, but he didn't vanish. The client delayed payment, said the death was too suspicious. Asked questions with smiling eyes. Was the job rushed? Was he warned? Rumors spread, small at first. A kill that didn't feel like his usual work. A hesitation. A whisper of mercy. Other clients noticed. One job vanished. Another came with conditions. Proof required. Witnesses removed. And suddenly, every dagger felt a little heavier. Every face at the tavern stared a little too long. The assassin had flinched once. That was enough to make the world suspicious. He tried to recover. Sharper routines. Cold detachment. He silenced his breath. Avoided eye contact. Killed the next 2 targets in record time. But it didn't matter, because now he had a reputation. Not for skill, for mercy. And in his world, mercy wasn't virtue. It was weakness. A crack in the mask. An invitation. One evening, a boy appeared at his door. No name, no smile, just a scroll. The target? Another assassin. Older, slower, once a legend. Now, a liability. It was a message. A warning dressed as a job. You hesitated. Now we're watching. That was the 6th lesson. Killing is easy. Staying cold? That's the cost. And once the warmth slips in, the ice never settles quite the same again. The most dangerous contracts never came from criminals. They came from saints. Or at least, people who believed they were. He recognized the type the moment they opened their mouths. Not desperate. Not guilty. Serene. Eyes glowing like stained glass. Hands folded like they'd just finished praying. Voices soft, measured. The tone of someone who'd already forgiven themselves. We're doing the right thing, they'd whisper. Always we. Like the blade was a collective sacrament. These weren't political kills. They were cleansings. Purgations. Sacrifices. This is justice, one had said, sliding a pouch across the table with 2 fingers and a crucifix. This is divine correction, said another, cloaked in silk and certainty. Once, he was hired by a monk. White robes, clean fingernails, mouth like a sword wrapped in scripture. The target? A nun. For blasphemy. She'd written a letter. That was all. He took the job. Not for the coin, for the clarity. He wanted to know how far someone would stretch holiness to justify a throat full of blood. Turns out, very far. When he asked the monk why, the man smiled. God doesn't need to explain himself. Neither do I. He killed the nun. Quick. Silent. But not before she looked at him. And said, I forgive you. It unsettled him more than any scream ever had. He didn't flinch. But something in his ribs cracked. Quietly. Like a shelf buckling under the weight of too many stories. After that, he started noticing patterns. Religious men paid in silence. Revolutionaries paid in promises. Philosophers didn't pay at all, just gave long speeches about moral consequence while handing over sealed envelopes. The common thread? Righteousness. He preferred contracts that came with fear. At least fear was honest. But righteousness. Righteousness wore a crown made of glass and dared you to shatter it. Some claimed prophecy. Some claimed politics. One woman swore her unborn child had told her who needed to die. Every one of them thought they were saving something. A nation. A soul. A story. They wanted a world scrubbed clean of contradiction. And they needed someone else to do the dirty work. That was him. The rag. The hand. The flame, if it kept their altars pure. And when it was over, they didn't thank him. They didn't look him in the eye. They simply turned away. As if sin, when outsourced, didn't stick. He stopped asking questions. Not because he didn't care, because the answers were too predictable. He wasn't afraid of devils anymore. Devils had rules. It was angels he feared now. The ones who smiled while pointing at corpses and whispering, "Necessary." That was the seventh lesson. The sharpest blades don't belong to killers. They belong to the ones who believe they're cutting for a higher cause. There was a time he remembered his name. Not the one he gave to strangers, or the one whispered in back rooms. His real name. The one someone once said softly. The one that, if spoken now, would sound like a lie. He tried to recall it once. Sat in an abandoned chapel with broken windows and candle stubs, whispering syllables like a man testing old keys in a rusted lock. Nothing fit. That's when he realized. He wasn't wearing a mask anymore. He was the mask. And there was nothing underneath. The mirror confirmed it. He rarely looked at himself. Superstition, maybe, or fear. But one night, while washing blood from his hands, he caught his reflection. Blank. Not cold. Not cruel. Just void. The eyes were tired. Not from running. From carrying. Every face he'd watched die was somewhere behind them, piled up like debts. He tried smiling. It felt foreign. Not fake, foreign. Like watching a stranger imitate humanity with all the right muscles, but none of the heat. He'd once had a laugh. He remembered that. Rough, ugly, honest. But it hadn't surfaced in years. The muscles had forgotten the choreography. Sometimes, in crowds, he'd wonder what he looked like. Not how he thought he looked. How others saw him. Did he seem lost? Dangerous? Forgettable? He hoped for forgettable. He always hoped for that. But a boy once stared too long. Not in fear. In curiosity. And something inside him recoiled. Not from the gaze, but from the realization that he wanted to be seen. That was the danger. Not the kill. Not the chase. The craving to exist again. To be more than footsteps in the rain. To be more than a blade with a pulse. He visited a brothel once. Not for pleasure. To remind himself what closeness used to feel like. The woman asked his name. He made one up. She smiled, touched his face, said, "You look like someone who once loved deeply." He left before dawn, didn't pay, didn't speak. The next day, he found her dead. Throat slit. Wrong place, wrong time. No message, no client, just coincidence. But something snapped. Not loudly, quiet, like cloth tearing in the dark. He stopped looking in mirrors after that. Stopped wondering who he used to be. Because the truth was simple. He no longer needed a name. Only an exit. That was the eighth lesson. If you live long enough in the dark, your reflection stops recognizing you. And sometimes, that's mercy. It was supposed to be a clean job. No witnesses. No drama. Just a man in the wrong place at the wrong time, and a client eager to correct that. He read the contract twice. Memorized the sketch. Noted the crooked nose, the scar above the left brow, the signet ring on the right hand. Easy. The target frequented a tavern on the river's edge. Drank too much. Spoke too loud. Bragged about secrets that weren't his to tell. The perfect kind of corpse. Predictable, disposable, forgettable. He watched for 3 nights. Learned the man's habits. Saw the ring, the scar, the nose. Watched him leave alone. Always alone. Then, on the fourth night, he followed. Waited. Struck. Quick. Precise. One motion. Practiced. A stagger. A knee buckled. Then the silence of a question answered too late. He took the ring, proof of death, and vanished. Easy. Too easy. The next morning, the message came. Sealed in red wax. No words. Just a coin. A coin meant wrong man. He didn't move for a long time. Just stared at it. A single object heavier than all the blood he'd ever spilled. He returned to the tavern. Same corner. Same server. Same stale smell of river rot. And there, laughing, alive, was the target. Real one. Identical ring. Identical scar. Identical face, but mirrored. Twins. Of course. It had been in the file, but only once, in small script, buried in the margin. He'd killed the wrong man. A brother. A father. A son. Someone who hadn't been meant to die. At least, not yet. And worse, people had seen. Not the kill, but the grief. The real target's grief. Public. Loud. The kind of grief that screamed vengeance before the tears dried. The assassin was good, but not invincible. And now, he was being hunted. Not by guards. Not by kings. But by someone with motive, means, and the advantage of not being a ghost. He moved cities. Changed names. Cut his hair with a dagger and started limping on the other leg. But the guilt, it didn't follow him. It waited, patiently, in dreams, in reflections, in the sudden panic when a door creaked too slowly. He started sleeping less, eating less, trusting nothing. Every shadow became a question. Every cough in the dark sounded like justice, finally catching up. And the client? Gone. Vanished. No accountability. No apology. Just silence. A stagger. A knee buckled. Then the silence of a question answered too late. He considered writing a letter. To the man he spared. To the brother he didn't mean to ruin. But what could he say? Sorry for tearing your life apart? Sorry for making you into me? No. Some ghosts don't deserve closure. That was the 9th lesson. You can vanish from every city, every face, every map, but not from the consequences of a name you never meant to erase. He always knew it would end like this. Not with a bang. Not with a trial. Not even with a final job gone wrong. Just a quiet room. A locked door. And the growing weight of being someone no one ever truly knew. There was no monument. No wanted poster. No whispered name in the halls of kings. He hadn't been hunted in years. Not because the world forgave him, but because it had forgotten him. The assassin had outlived his purpose. The coins stopped coming. The clients stopped calling. Even the blades, once an extension of his hand, began to rust. He tried retiring once. Bought a farmhouse on a hill no map remembered. Planted vegetables. Watched the seasons spin their slow theater across the soil. But the silence wasn't peace. It was a tomb, because he had buried so many versions of himself that now, there was no one left to talk to. He'd watch the sun rise, feel nothing, watch it set, still nothing. And the worst part? No nightmares. Not anymore. They had gotten bored. moved on to fresher souls. He had become invisible, even to guilt. Then, one day, a letter came. No seal, no sender, just a folded piece of parchment and 3 words. You were seen. No threats, no name, just the kind of message that wasn't a warning, but a mirror. Someone remembered. Someone still watched. And for the first time in years, he smiled. Because being remembered meant he existed. He packed a bag. Not much, a blade, a flask, the letter. Left the vegetables to rot. Didn't lock the door. There was nothing worth stealing anymore. He walked into the fog. Not to run. Not to hide. To chase something. Or be chased. It didn't matter. What mattered was motion. The life of an assassin doesn't end in death. It ends in stillness. And he wasn't ready to be still. That was the 10th and final lesson. You don't disappear by vanishing. You disappear by being remembered only as a whisper that never stayed still long enough to echo. So if you ever pass a stranger in a crowd, with eyes too quiet, hands too steady, and a face you swear you've seen in a dream, don't ask questions. Just keep walking, because ghosts walk like that. And so he walked into the fog, disappearing like a stain in rainwater, like all the men who thought silence would save them. But not all ghosts come with blades. Some wear lipstick, speak like fire, and write with knives. Let's drift now, to another kind of war, to a battlefield made of cafes, typewriters, and unwanted truths. Paris, 1940s, where a woman wasn't asking for permission anymore. She was rewriting the entire contract of existence. They say she was born in Paris. But no, she arrived, fully aware, slightly annoyed, with the faint suspicion that the world had already gotten it all wrong. And the world? It panicked. Because when a woman isn't trying to please you, what do you even do with her? From the beginning, Simone looked at femininity like a strange ritual. Tea parties, corsets, polite smiles, husbands. A performance with no script that interested her. She preferred books and ideas and writing things no one asked her to write, especially about women, especially when it made men squirm. Her teachers called her brilliant. Her parents called her difficult. They weren't wrong. She grew up in a France that taught girls to fold themselves. Into marriages. Into children. Into nice shapes that didn't take up space. Simone, instead, unfolded. She read Kant before breakfast. Wrote essays instead of love letters. And when someone tried to tame her, she gave them a look sharp enough to require stitches. She wasn't trying to be like the men. She just didn't want to be like the women they'd made. There's a difference. And she wasn't lonely. She was surrounded by minds. Dead ones, living ones, complicated ones. Plato, Descartes, Sartre. Yes, that's Sartre. But we'll get to him later. Much, much later. For now, Simone de Beauvoir was just a girl, who refused to be just a girl. And that was her first act of rebellion. Not burning bras, not screaming in the streets, but refusing to become the thing they told her she already was. When Simone met Sartre, it wasn't love at first sight. It was recognition. Like two predators sniffing each other across a room full of prey. He was short, sharp, arrogant. She was sharp, arrogant, taller, which, in Paris, was considered an act of war. They talked, and talked, and talked, for hours, days, lifetimes. While others kissed in parks and wrote poetry in notebooks, Simone and Sartre devoured each other with syllables. They weren't dating, they were dueling. In philosophy, in theory, in unapologetic existentialism. He offered her the only bouquet she'd ever accept. The chance to never belong to anyone. Not even to him. No marriage. No kids. No kitchen. Just freedom. With a few footnotes. They became what the French politely call a free union. Which, in modern terms, translates to, "You're mine, but not really. We're together, unless I'm not. Let's love each other, and also sleep with everyone else." Romantic, isn't it? But this wasn't about bodies. It was about minds. She didn't want to be someone's wife. She wanted to be someone's equal. And Sartre, for all his smugness, treated her as such. They wrote side by side, challenged each other, corrected each other's essays with the same tenderness most couples reserve for pillow talk. But make no mistake, this wasn't cute. It was brutal. He'd critique her pages until they bled. She'd remind him that his fame didn't make him right. There were affairs, jealousies, power games disguised as logic. But through it all, she stayed. Not because she couldn't leave, but because it was her choice to stay. And choice, for Simone, was sacred. She didn't want the fantasy. She wanted the friction, the tension, the endless clash of intellects that made her feel alive. Sartre once said she was the greatest mind he ever met. He was wrong, of course. She was the greatest mind he ever met. The rest of the world would catch up later. That was the second act of rebellion. To love a man deeply, without ever vanishing into him. There are books that change lives. And then there are books that ruin dinner parties. In 1949, Simone de Beauvoir published The Second Sex. And suddenly, every man in Europe felt personally attacked. Because they were. It wasn't a manifesto. It wasn't a call to arms. It was worse. It was a mirror, held up to an entire civilization. And the reflection wasn't flattering. The book asked one simple, devastating question. Why is woman the other? And then it answered it. In 900 pages. With receipts. With historical dissection. With philosophical evisceration. She ripped through centuries of myth and doctrine. From Aristotle to the Church. From marriage contracts to Freud's confused notes. She dismantled the idea that women were born submissive. She proved they were trained to be. She didn't shout. She didn't beg. She exposed. And the world did what it always does when a woman tells the truth. They called her dangerous, unstable, sexually frustrated, and worst of all, unfeminine. Because a woman who thinks is already halfway to rebellion. And a woman who writes it down? That's a revolution. The Vatican banned the book. Universities whispered about it. And housewives hid it between their cookbooks like contraband. But those who read it? They didn't just understand themselves. They remembered who they could have been. Simone didn't give them permission. She gave them vocabulary. For rage. For exhaustion. For the aching suspicion that being a wife and mother shouldn't be the whole plot. She told them what no one else would. You are not an accessory. You are not a metaphor. You are not a vessel. You are, in fact, a subject. Not an echo. Not a muse. Not the shadow behind a genius. But a complete being, with the right, no, the duty, to define herself. That was the third act of rebellion. To write the truth, knowing it would make her hated. And she wrote it anyway. She never wanted children. Not a single one. Not because she was cold, or selfish, or broken, but because she knew something most people spend a lifetime denying. Some women don't want to duplicate themselves. They want to invent themselves. While others built nurseries, Simone built frameworks. While others read bedtime stories, she wrote chapters that kept entire institutions up at night. She didn't raise a child. She raised hell. And for that, she was crucified. The press labeled her unnatural. The church called her a threat to the family. And conservatives whispered the worst insult they could think of. She's not even a mother. But here's the twist. She was. She became a mother of ideas, of disobedience, of the terrifying notion that women could choose not to be mothers, and still be complete. Young women began writing to her. From France, from Brazil, from towns so small they didn't even have names, only husbands. They called her Ma Mère Intellectuelle, my intellectual mother. She didn't offer comfort. She offered clarity. She didn't say, "You'll be fine." She said, "Burn the script." Her mentorship wasn't soft. It was rigorous. She held her protégés to the same standard she held herself. No excuses. No surrender. No slipping back into roles because they're easier to explain at dinner. She mentored writers, thinkers, rebels. Sometimes lovingly. Sometimes ruthlessly. She didn't need to swaddle you. She needed to wake you up. Simone believed that if you had the ability to think critically, you had the obligation to do it. No comfort zones. No default lives. No quiet, miserable compromises disguised as femininity. She didn't mother bodies. She mothered minds. That was her fourth rebellion. To create a legacy of daughters, without ever giving birth. They wanted her to be perfect, to smile more, to apologize less, to be revolutionary, but in a polite, photogenic, and morally convenient way. Simone de Beauvoir refused. She was not your idol. She was not your role model. She was not your mother, your therapist, or your savior. She was flawed, deeply, brilliantly, humanly, and that was her power. She loved fiercely, sometimes manipulatively. She mentored young women, and sometimes blurred lines that shouldn't have been blurred. She defied gender roles, but tolerated Sartre's worst habits. She dismantled patriarchy, but stayed loyal to a man who weaponized emotional detachment. She wasn't always kind. She wasn't always fair. She was sometimes cruel, sometimes arrogant, sometimes absolutely insufferable. And yet, she never pretended otherwise. That was the scandal. Not that she made mistakes, but that she refused to atone for them publicly, while others sanitized their images for applause. Simone sharpened hers like a blade. She said what no one wanted to admit. Yes, I am a feminist. No, I do not owe you a spotless life. She didn't want to be worshipped. She wanted to be read, questioned, ripped apart and put back together again in dialogue, not devotion. And that terrified people, because most revolutions want martyrs. Simone gave them mirrors. She stood at the center of the feminist movement. And then, without asking permission, she stepped aside, not because she didn't care, but because she knew that no ideology should ever be built around a single face. Not even hers. She was the friction, not the flame, the storm cloud, not the thunder. And when the room caught fire, she was already somewhere else, lighting the next fuse. To lead a revolution, without dying to become its saint. She saw it coming, not like a thief in the night, but like a shadow that never stopped stretching. Old age, the final rebellion. Simone didn't ignore it, didn't Botox it, didn't pretend it was just a number. She looked it in the eye, and wrote a book about it. La Vieillesse. Old age, not a memoir, a scalpel, dissecting the cultural amnesia that renders the elderly invisible. Because growing old as a man is becoming wise. But growing old as a woman? That's becoming irrelevant. And Simone, the woman who never asked for permission to exist, wasn't going to disappear quietly. She wrote about bodies that sag, about hands that shake, about being seen as a has-been in a world that only applauds youth with cleavage. She wrote about loneliness, the kind that isn't poetic, just practical. The death of her mother hit her first, then the slow decline of Sartre, then her own body, turning into a battlefield she no longer controlled. Her skin betrayed her. Her voice lost its edge. Her days became longer, and her place in the movement she helped ignite? More ceremonial. But she didn't romanticize it. She exposed it. She wrote, "To grow old is to learn the price of being born." And yet, there was no self-pity, only clarity, only that brutal honesty she'd weaponized her whole life. She hated nostalgia. She didn't look back fondly. She didn't bathe in memory. She bathed in truth. Aging, for Simone, wasn't a tragedy. It was just another system. One more script to refuse. That was the sixth rebellion. To age without apologies. To wither in full view. To grow old not gracefully, but consciously. When Sartre died in 1980, the newspapers cried louder than Simone did. He was the face, the thinker, the celebrity philosopher. She was his shadow, they said, as if she hadn't eclipsed him decades earlier. But she didn't argue. She never wasted breath on correcting the blind. She buried him, quietly, efficiently, like someone burying a colleague, not a soulmate, because Sartre wasn't her fairy tale. He was her war, and now the war was over. She felt it in her bones, in the sudden emptiness of mornings that no longer began with an argument. A letter, a manuscript covered in ink and sarcasm. They had spent half a century refusing convention, and yet, death still felt like abandonment. She didn't collapse. She documented. She wrote adieus, a farewell to Sartre. Not a love letter, not a eulogy, a reckoning. She described his decay, his forgetfulness, his delusions, his final days like a sponge. Soft, soaked, losing shape. She didn't romanticize him. She recorded him, because that was their pact. No illusions, not even at the end. People called her cruel, unfeeling, a traitor to grief. But Simone never grieved like other people. She mourned with facts, with syntax, with dignity so sharp it could cut through flowers. While others cried, she wrote. While others faltered, she documented. Her grief wasn't poetic, it was precise. And for that, the world gasped, as if truth was uglier than fiction. But Simone knew. Grief isn't soft. It's blunt. It's repetitive. It's not a violin in the background. It's an empty chair. That was the seventh rebellion. To love without losing herself. To mourn without melodrama. To say goodbye, without pretending he completed her. They wanted her to vanish. To retreat gracefully. To knit in silence. To be a relic, elegant, irrelevant, and quietly dead inside. But Simone kept writing, kept smoking, kept speaking in that same flat, unapologetic voice that had offended people since she was 20. She didn't mellow. She didn't soften. She didn't perform the gentle fade-out society reserves for old women and tired legends. Instead, she stayed. Visible. Sharp. Inconvenient. Her mere presence was a protest. Her refusal to disappear was an act of defiance. She walked into salons and made the air tense. She appeared on television and made the host sweat. And still, she spoke. Not about makeup for aging skin. Not about recipes. Not about grandchildren. She had none, remember? She spoke about abortion. About class. About how feminism was being watered down into slogans you could print on a t-shirt. About how the movement she helped birth was now being marketed. And misunderstood. People started saying she was outdated. Which is what you call a woman who refuses to outlive her usefulness quietly. She didn't tweet. Didn't smile for cameras. Didn't say girl power in pastel fonts. She said, "You still don't get it, do you?" And they didn't. They wanted feminism to be cute now. Digestible. Brand safe. Simone was none of that. She was the living reminder that progress wasn't a product. That liberation wasn't a vibe. That freedom had wrinkles, bitterness, contradictions, and a lot of unfinished business. That was her eighth rebellion. To live long enough to make people uncomfortable, even after they started calling her a legend. When Simone died in 1986, the headlines came quickly. Feminist icon dies at 78. The voice of a generation falls silent. Suddenly, everyone had always admired her. Everyone had read her. Everyone had a quote to post beside her photograph. Cropped, desaturated, decontextualized. Even the institutions she spent her life dismantling lined up to speak. Universities that never hired her. Newspapers that once mocked her. Men who never understood her. And women who resented her honesty. They all showed up, like mourners at a crime scene, hoping their presence would erase their fingerprints. There were flowers. There were speeches. There were summaries of her work, sanitized for public consumption. They called her brilliant, after they'd spent decades trying to silence her. Complex, as if that was a compliment, not a concession. And they buried her next to Sartre, like proximity could simplify the story. They quoted the second sex, but never the uncomfortable parts. And then they buried her, next to Sartre, as if that would make the narrative easier to tell. Lovers, philosophers, a tidy duet of French intellect. But Simone never wanted to be remembered for whom she loved. She wanted to be remembered for what she dismantled. And yet, even in death, the world tried to dress her up. Tried to make her soft, palatable, historic, as in, no longer threatening. But the truth? Simone wasn't history. She was unfinished business. She didn't die with a halo. She died with pages left in her typewriter. That was her ninth rebellion. To leave behind a world still scrambling to define her. Because she'd spent her life refusing to be defined. Simone de Beauvoir didn't slam the door behind her. She didn't carve her name into marble. Didn't demand statues. Didn't declare herself complete. She just stepped aside. Not out of humility, but out of strategy. She knew that revolutions built on a single woman crumble the moment her voice fades. So she made space. Not peace. Not comfort. Space. For misfits. For thinkers. For women who didn't want to marry the first man who could spell love. She left the blueprint, not the instructions, because she never believed in obedience, only in awareness. Her legacy isn't something you memorize. It's something you wrestle with. She didn't raise banners. She raised questions that make your stomach twist at 2 a.m. What does freedom feel like when no one's watching? Who would you be if no one expected anything? And most of all, are you living your life, or someone else's idea of what it should look like? She didn't give answers. She handed you the scalpel. She said, "I tore down the walls I was born inside. Now hand me the hammer. Let's see what else is fake." And then, she vanished. Not into myth. Not into sainthood. Into that quiet place where unfinished revolutions breathe. She left the door open. Not wide, just enough. Enough for the next girl to see the light leaking in. Enough for you. Enough for now. And that's the thing about Simone de Beauvoir. She didn't ask to be remembered. She demanded to be reconsidered. Not as a saint. Not as a slogan. But as a storm that passed through the 20th century. And didn't bother to clean up after herself. So tonight, if her story made you uncomfortable, good. She would have loved that. And if it made you think about yourself, about freedom, about how many lies you're still politely swallowing, even better. Because this isn't the end. This is the hallway. You've got the match. The question is, what are you going to burn? If you made it this far, don't forget to leave a like, share this video with someone who's still calling Simone Sartre's girlfriend. And hit subscribe if you want more stories that don't tuck you in. They wake you up. My name's not important. But the fire? That's yours now. Good night. And may you always walk toward the door she left open. Not waiting for permission, just pushing it wider.